Hey everyone, let's dive right into this explainer. For those of you out there building autonomous communities and functioning totally outside the traditional state apparatus, you know that figuring out how to handle conflict without resorting to coercion or police is absolutely foundational, right? So today, we're unpacking the source texts to see exactly why punitive justice is facing such heavy criticism and how entirely new frameworks are being built from the ground up. Let's get into it. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by understanding retributive justice, then look at the restorative justice approach, dig into the limits of restorative justice, define transformative justice, and finally, look at some real-world tools for community intervention. What if crime wasn't just a broken law, but a broken relationship? Man, this single provocative question perfectly sets up the massive paradigm shift we're going to unpack today. The text we're looking at suggests that how we frame a harm dictates exactly how we respond to it. Like, if we only see broken rules, we're going to look for punishment. But if we see broken relationships, we naturally start looking for healing. All right, Section 1, Understanding Retributive Justice. Okay, so let's start with the baseline model that pretty much dominates our society right now, retributive justice. To actually build community-based alternatives, the sources argue that we first have to really understand the nuts and bolts of the system we're trying to leave behind. According to the texts, this model views crimes strictly as a violation of the state and its laws. It relies entirely on inflicting pain or withholding liberties as a response. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime actually notes that the main focus here is just establishing guilt and punishing the rule breaker. It basically operates on this logic that a moral imbalance can only be fixed by hurting the person who caused the harm in the first place. Now, check this out. What law was broken? Who broke it? What is the punishment? Notice how these three core questions completely erase the victim and the community from the whole justice equation. They just defer all responsibility straight to the state. The sources heavily criticize this punitive approach. They point out that by making the state the primary victim of any crime, the actual living, breathing people involved are just sidelined. It strips away control, responsibility, and the potential for healing, leaving the actual victims feeling totally powerless. Moving on to Section 2, the restorative justice approach. So as communities saw just how limited these punitive approaches were and recognized the deep trauma they tend to leave behind, a movement in the 1970s brought forth a much more relational alternative. This comparison brilliantly illustrates that shift. We move completely away from asking what law was broken to focusing squarely on identifying and repairing the actual harm done to real people. The restorative framework simply asks, what is the harm and how do we repair it? It literally changes the entire objective from inflicting a penalty to figuring out how to actually make things right. The sources outline that restorative justice is a dialogue-driven approach that champions nonviolence and cooperation. It brings stakeholders face-to-face to hold offenders accountable for human violations rather than just legal infractions. It views crime as an injury to people and relationships. The ultimate goal here? To restore the independence and power that the crime took away from the victim, while having the offender actively learn new, healthier ways of existing within the community. And the absolutely crucial point here is that without identifying the harms and needs, acknowledging the obligations, and engaging all parties, true restorative justice simply doesn't exist. According to Howard Zier, who's widely considered a pioneer in this space, these three pillars are totally non-negotiable. It requires voluntary participation and honest, truthful speaking in a safe environment. But as we're going to see, even this highly cooperative model has its critics when you zoom out to look at the broader picture. Which brings us to Section 3, Limits of Restorative Justice. While restorative justice does a great job repairing interpersonal relationships, critics in the late 1990s started pointing out some really crucial blind spots. And for a community that is deeply invested in dismantling oppressive structures, this critique is absolutely vital. The main concern, highlighted perfectly by this quote, is that if you just put a victim and an offender in a room to talk about a specific incident, you're treating them as equal agents in a vacuum. You're completely ignoring the massive institutional inequalities that might be driving the conflict in the first place. Advocates for a broader framework argue that because society itself oppresses marginalized groups, a simple interpersonal mediation just can't fix a conflict that's actually rooted in institutional inequality. The sources point out that restorative justice might agree the current system is flawed, but it doesn't actually dismantle why it's racist, classist, or sexist. It also really struggles in situations where a survivor of abuse has to use violence to protect themselves, mostly because the restorative framework rigidly adheres to a very simple victim versus offender binary. Let's get into Section 4, Defining Transformative Justice. Those exact critiques lead us directly to the next evolution in this paradigm, heavily influenced by the radical social movements of the 1960s. This is where we get into the theoretical framework that actively seeks to bypass the state altogether. Transformative justice uses a whole systems approach, demanding that not just the offender, but everyone and everything, including our societal structures, has to change. The texts are super clear here. Transformative justice is explicitly based on prison abolition. It totally refuses to rely on police, courts, or the criminal legal system, arguing that those state institutions actually condone and perpetuate cycles of violence. Instead, it empowers everyday people, rather than state institutions, to make the decisions. The sources use a really specific case study to show how this systems approach works. Imagine a 14-year-old poor queer boy robs a store at 2 a.m. If you just look at the burglary, you only see one victim and one offender, right? But through a transformative lens, as outlined by the Save the Kids organization in the text, we actually have to ask why the boy was out at 2 a.m. Was he homeless? Was he kicked out by a homophobic parent? By asking these deeper questions, we identify that the boy is actually a victim too, a victim of a wider systemic injustice. You literally cannot resolve the interpersonal harm without addressing that systemic context. Looking at this timeline, I want you to think of this evolution almost like concentric circles. We're expanding our focus from the individual rule breaker out to the interpersonal relationship, and finally, all the way out to the entire societal system. It is a fascinating progression. We go from simply trying to perform the courts in the 70s to completely rejecting state authority and demanding total liberation from all systems of domination by the late 90s, heavily popularized by figures like Ruth Morris. And finally, Section 5. Tools for community intervention. So the theory sounds incredible, but how does it actually work on the ground? If transformative justice doesn't rely on police, courts, or the state, how does a community actually pull it off? Well, organizations like Creative Interventions, founded in Oakland in 2004, developed literal toolkits to equip everyday people with the skills to address violence themselves. They saw that organizations usually either view violence as an individual problem or they just rely on the police. So they created these practical guides to strengthen community-based systems, meaning your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers. The goal is empowering them to intervene, provide safety, and actually create accountability without ever calling the authorities. This table right here perfectly captures that massive shift. It's all about divesting from state responses that advocates argue just perpetuate cycles of violence and instead turning toward community allies to build genuine safety. Look at the primary actors. We're shifting away from police and judges straight to family and neighbors. We are moving from a coercive adversarial process to one that is entirely collaborative and voluntary. And crucially, a community intervention actually acknowledges the real sociopolitical differences, like race, class, and gender, that the traditional legal system blindly pretends don't exist. The core philosophy driving all of this is that to live truly violence-free lives, communities have to develop holistic strategies that confront both state violence and interpersonal violence at the exact same time. The sources highlight this historic joint statement from Insight and Critical Resistance. It points out a huge issue. Activists fighting state violence, like police brutality, often work in total isolation from those fighting domestic violence. Transformative justice demands that we bridge that gap. We have to create strategies that keep survivors safe without relying on what the sources describe as a fundamentally sexist, racist, and classist criminal justice system. This quote beautifully summarizes the ultimate goal, a non-dogmatic, community-driven philosophy for total transformation. It is not just about finding a new way to punish someone. It's a comprehensive social justice philosophy that treats conflict as an opportunity for profound growth and radical progress. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to consider the next time you encounter a conflict in your own community. If our systems of justice focused entirely on healing and accountability rather than punishment, how would that change the way you respond to conflict in your own life? For those of us dedicated to building mutual aid and self-governance, this really isn't just theory. It is the practical, everyday work of building a new world. How will you apply these tools to foster true accountability? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep building.